This is the story of how one factory inspection in India left cancer patients across the United States unable to get the chemotherapy they needed. It's also the reason public health experts now warn that the system delivering the world's medicine is far more fragile than almost anyone realizes. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to trace how decades of decisions, each one reasonable on its own, built a global drug supply chain that can be knocked sideways by a tornado, a hurricane, or one plant simply closing its doors. We'll look at how we arrived here, what's already broken, and whether the aggressive measures being taken right now will repair the problem or deepen it. The clearest way in is the case that made all of this impossible to ignore. Late in 2022, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration sent inspectors to a plant run by Intas Pharmaceuticals in Gujarat, India. The inspection stretched across 9 days, from November 22nd to December 2nd, and what those inspectors found alarmed them enough that the FDA later described it as a cascade of failure inside the plant's quality control unit. 11 formal observations came out of that visit. Among the findings, inspectors documented a truck filled with transparent plastic bags of shredded documents, alongside black plastic bags holding paperwork torn randomly into pieces. Once the inspection wrapped, Intas suspended production for the U.S. market, and here's why that single decision mattered so much. That one plant supplied roughly half the cisplatin used in the entire United States. Cisplatin is a platinum-based chemotherapy drug, a genuine workhorse of cancer treatment, and according to the National Cancer Institute, up to 20% of cancer patients depend on platinum-based chemotherapy. When a single facility making half the national supply goes dark, the damage refuses to stay contained. By February of 2023, cisplatin had slipped into shortage, and as hospitals and patients pivoted to its sister drug carboplatin, that one ran short as well. Experts call this a cascading shortage, one failure spilling directly into the next. The scale of it was hard to overstate. A National Comprehensive Cancer Network survey published on June 7, 2023, found that 93% of surveyed cancer centers reported a carboplatin shortage, with around 70% reporting a cisplatin shortage. Hospitals started rationing doses, prioritizing the patients most likely to benefit. Dr. Angeles Alvarez-Secord of Duke called it the most critical chemotherapy shortage she'd ever seen, describing the situation plainly as a public health emergency. The fix revealed everything. To ease the crisis, the FDA used its regulatory discretion to permit temporary importation of cisplatin from China's Qilu Pharmaceutical, a product not actually approved for sale in the United States. Regulators also cleared Intas to resume shipping cisplatin, carboplatin, and 14 other injectables under third-party quality verification. And by early 2024, the White House reported that cisplatin supply had climbed back to roughly 100% of pre-shortage levels. Sit with what just happened there. A national chemotherapy emergency was solved, in part, by importing an unapproved drug from China. That single fact tells you how thin the margins of this system really are, because one plant and one inspection put an entire country's cancer treatment in jeopardy. To understand how a lone factory gains that kind of power, we need to look at how the modern drug supply chain actually functions. When you swallow a pill, the part that actually treats you is called the active pharmaceutical ingredient, API, the biologically active component that produces the drug's effect. That ingredient does not appear from nowhere, though. It gets synthesized from what the industry calls key starting materials and intermediates, those become the API, and the API then gets converted into the finished pill or injection in a step known as fill finish. Here is the detail that changes everything. Each of these stages routinely happens in a different country, with the starting materials made in one place, the API in another, and the final product somewhere else entirely. Now, stack the economics on top of that geography. Generic drugs account for about 90% of U.S. prescription volume, yet they represent only 13.1% of prescription drug spending and just 1.2% of total U.S. healthcare spending. Figures drawn from the Association for Accessible Medicine's 2024 Savings Report, using data from the IQVIA Institute. Think about what those numbers actually mean. 9 of every 10 prescriptions are generics, and they sell for pennies per dose. In 2023 alone, generics saved the United States an estimated $445 billion, with more than $3.1 trillion in savings across the prior decade, which is a tremendous deal for patients. The catch is that it leaves manufacturers with almost no margin. No money for backup suppliers, no money for redundant capacity, and no money for the kind of quality investment that keeps a plant from being shut down in the first place. This is the root economic problem, a system tuned for the lowest possible price, where the lowest possible price buys the thinnest possible safety margin. That fragility surfaces in a handful of specific choke points. The first is single-source manufacturing, since by one widely cited estimate, around 40% of U.S. generics have only one FDA-approved manufacturer. The second is the geographic concentration of those starting materials and intermediates inside China. The third involves sterile injectables, the drugs delivered by IV or injection, which are complex to produce, made by very few companies, and dominant in hospital shortages. Here's the part most people overlook. China's grip is tightest at the very bottom of the chain, the key starting materials and intermediates, where over 20 years, strict Western environmental rules and thin margins pushed producers in the US, Europe, and even India out of that low-end chemistry. The result is striking, because even a drug stamped "Made in India" or "Made in USA" is frequently, in pure chemical terms, Chinese in origin. The obvious question, then, is how a country that once led the world in this work ended up here. And for that, we have to go back several decades. In the mid-1990s, the United States, Europe, and Japan together produced roughly 90% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients, and that dominance didn't survive the years that followed. The last United States aspirin manufacturing plant closed its doors in 2002. 2 years later came a moment experts returned to again and again, when the last United States penicillin fermentation plant shut down, a Bristol-Myers Squibb facility in East Syracuse, New York. Rosemary Gibson, a senior advisor at the Hastings Center and the author of the book China RX, has testified about exactly how this unfolded. By her account, Chinese producers formed a cartel and used below-market pricing to drive United States, European, and Indian competitors out of the market, then raised prices once they held control. Her testimony put it bluntly: the United States can no longer make penicillin, and the last United States penicillin fermentation plant closed in 2004. The broader numbers carry the same weight. According to Senator Rick Scott, chairman of the Senate Special Committee on Aging, United States domestic active pharmaceutical ingredient production fell from 84% of the United States market in 2002 to just 37% today. and 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in essential medicines now have no United States source whatsoever. This story isn't only about lost jobs or vanished capacity, though, because in 2008, it turned deadly. Heparin is a blood thinner, a hospital drug that patients depend on. In 2008, a contaminated supply of it sourced from China made its way into the U.S. market. The crude material had been processed at a plant in Changzhou, China, operated by a company called Scientific Protein Laboratories, before being finished by Baxter. None of this happened by accident. The heparin had been adulterated with a substance called oversulfated chondroitin sulfate, a cheaper mimic specifically able to slip past the standard tests used to verify the drug. And Baxter's chairman later testified that the contamination appeared deliberate. Regulators connected that tainted heparin to at least 81 deaths and 785 reports of serious injuries. Janet Woodcock, then a senior FDA official, noted in congressional testimony that 62 of those deaths occurred in just a few months between November 2007 and February 2008. This was the cautionary tale, the moment that exposed the deadly downside of a supply chain stretched across the globe with quality control that no one was watching closely enough. The disaster pushed the FDA to start stationing inspectors overseas. Yet, as the 2023 chemotherapy crisis already showed us, the underlying vulnerability never disappeared. The danger also is not limited to quality failures or distant factories, because sometimes the threat arrives as weather. Because so much production sits concentrated in so few places, a single storm hitting a single facility can ripple straight through the entire system. On July 19, 2023, an EF3 tornado tore into a Pfizer facility in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, one of the world's largest sterile injectable plants, spanning over 1.4 million square feet with around 3,200 employees, and producing nearly a quarter of Pfizer's sterile injectables, along with about 8% of all the sterile injectables used in U.S. hospitals. Roughly 50,000 pallets of medicine took damage in that storm. The warehouse absorbed the worst of it, rather than the production lines themselves, which meant most lines were running again by late September. Just over a year later, a heavier blow landed. In late September 2024, Hurricane Helene flooded Baxter International's North Cove plant in North Carolina, the largest U.S. maker of I-5 and peritoneal dialysis solutions, turning out about 60% of the IV fluids used in American hospitals. Roughly 1.5 million bags a day, according to the American Hospital Association. When that plant went down, the country tipped into a national IV fluid shortage. Baxter had to fire up 9 of its global plants to compensate. The FDA authorized temporary importation of 23 IV and peritoneal products, and the company projected a hit of around $200 million to its fourth quarter sales before restoring pre-hurricane production by February of 2025. Line these episodes up side by side. The Pfizer tornado, the Baxter hurricane, the INTA's inspection, and a pattern snaps into focus. In each case, a huge share of national supply was concentrated in a single point of failure. And when that point failed, the system held almost no slack to absorb the loss. This is a global problem, and to see its full shape, we have to look well beyond the United States. India is often called the pharmacy of the world, supplying around 20% of global generic drug volume and over 60% of global vaccine demand, while meeting roughly 40% of U.S. generic demand. India's own foundation is precarious in exactly the same way, though, because the country imports 70 to 80% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients and key starting materials from China. For some essentials, that dependence runs nearly total. By various 2024 estimates, India sources roughly 91% of its paracetamol, around 95% of its penicillin and salts, and over 95% of its ibuprofen ingredients from China, which means that when the world leans on India, India is leaning on China underneath it. To break free, India's government is pushing what it calls production-linked incentive schemes and bulk drug parks, aiming for 70% active pharmaceutical ingredient self-reliance by 2030. Europe finds itself caught in the same bind. The European Union ran into severe amoxicillin shortages starting in 2022, with a formal alert from the European Medicines Agency in January of 2023 and by the winter from 2023 to 2024. 17 countries across the European Economic Area reported critical antibiotic shortages. Europe relies on imports for up to 80% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients, mostly from China and India. European active pharmaceutical ingredient production slid from 53% in the early 2000s to under 25% today, according to a 2024 report led by Enrico Letta. Europe's answer is a piece of legislation called the Critical Medicines Act, first proposed in March of 2025. The Council settled its position in December of 2025, and the European Parliament adopted its own position in January of 2026 by a vote of 503 to 57, introducing BY European procurement criteria along with mechanisms for joint purchasing and strategic projects. None of this is an American problem with an American solution then. It's a global dependence on a handful of choke points, and right now governments around the world are scrambling to respond, with the most forceful response of all coming from the United States. The current U.S. approach ranks as the most aggressive in decades, and it pushes forward on several fronts at once. The first front is tariffs. On April 1st, 2025, the Commerce Department opened a national security investigation into pharmaceutical imports, and President Trump first announced a 100% tariff on branded, patented pharmaceuticals in September of 2025. The formal proclamation followed on April 2nd, 2026, imposing a 100% tariff on patented pharmaceuticals and their APIs. One detail carries real weight here. Generics and biosimilars are exempt, at least for now, pending a one-year review. The tariff arrives with staggered effective dates and a tiered system of relief, where companies can shrink or eliminate the charge by agreeing to certain pricing arrangements and approved plans to move manufacturing onshore. The White House cited approximately $400 billion in fresh investment commitments spurred by these measures, though it's fair to be clear that these represent administration-stated commitments rather than independently audited spending. The second front is stockpiling. An executive order signed on August 13, 2025, created what's called a strategic API reserve, directing federal health authorities to identify about 26 critical drugs and stockpile a 6-month supply of their active ingredients, with a preference for domestic sourcing. That same order noted a stark reality that only about 10% of APIs for U.S. prescription drugs are currently made on American soil. A third front is the Biosecure Act, which became law on December 18, 2025. The legislation restricts federal procurement from certain biotechnology companies tied to a Department of Defense list of companies of concern. In June 2026, the major contract manufacturer Wuxi Aptec landed on that list, pulling it within the law's reach, and the company called the designation mistaken and baseless. The companies themselves make up the final front through reshoring. Back in February 2025, Eli Lilly announced $27 billion for 4 new U.S. plants, lifting its total U.S. commitment past $50 billion. Johnson & Johnson committed around $55 billion, and Novartis around $23 billion. On paper, that's an enormous mobilization, but not everyone agrees it will work, and some experts warn it could backfire. Here sits the central controversy. The administration frames tariffs and national security designations as the tools to rebuild domestic capacity, and the logic runs straight. Make importing expensive enough, and manufacturing comes home. Critics see it differently. Independent pharmacists, the Association for Accessible Medicines, and academic researchers argue the opposite, that tariffs raise prices and could actually worsen generic shortages. Circle back to the economics for a moment. Generic makers already operate on razor-thin margins, which means that piling on new costs could drive some of them to exit the U.S. market entirely rather than absorb the hit. John Murphy, Chief Executive Officer of the Association for Accessible Medicines, put it directly when he said generic manufacturers simply cannot absorb new costs, and reshoring offers no quick fix, since building that capacity takes years. The debate comes with hard numbers attached. A report prepared by EY for the pharmaceutical industry group FIAS-OMRAM-A, reviewed by Reuters in April 2025, estimated that a 25% pharmaceutical tariff would raise U.S. drug costs by nearly $51 billion a year, potentially lifting prices by as much as 12.9% if those costs got passed on. Researchers at Johns Hopkins warned in June 2025 that tariffs would worsen generic shortages while driving up prices on branded drugs. Genuine disagreement also surrounds the question of how dependent the U.S. actually is on China, because the estimates swing wildly depending on how you measure. By direct volume of active pharmaceutical ingredient, one estimate from the U.S. Pharmacopeia puts China at around 8%. Factor in indirect exposure, the Chinese ingredients flowing through India, for instance, and that figure climbs to roughly 47%. China supplies only about 3.7% of U.S. pharmaceutical imports by dollar value, yet about 31% by weight. The Brookings Institution has cautioned against both complacency and exaggeration here, pointing out that the Food and Drug Administration cannot reliably measure actual production volumes from facility registrations alone. The honest answer is that the experts don't fully agree, not on the scale of the dependence, and not on whether the current remedies will help or hurt. What they do agree on is that the underlying fragility is real, which raises the question of where things actually stand right now. Is the system genuinely collapsing? This is where precision matters. The data tells a more complicated story than pure catastrophe. U.S. drug shortages did reach an all-time high, 323 active shortages in the first quarter of 2024, according to ASHP, the organization that tracks this most closely, and as ASHP's Chief Executive Officer, Paul Abramowitz, noted, that figure surpassed the previous record of 320 shortages set back in 2014. Something shifted after that, though. New shortages in 2025 dropped to 89, the lowest annual total since 2006, which marks a real improvement in the rate of fresh problems appearing. The backlog refuses to clear, however. Active shortages crept back up to 223 in the first quarter of 2026, and around 3/4 of active shortages began in 2022 or later. New problems are surfacing more slowly, yet the old ones prove stubborn and slow to resolve, a dynamic Michael Gagno of ASHP described simply, noting that new shortages are occurring at about the same rate that older shortages are resolving. The accurate picture, then, isn't a system in total freefall. It's a system of chronic, structural fragility, punctuated by acute shocks, where the phrase "on the brink of collapse" functions as the warning rather than the diagnosis. What would push it closer to that brink? Active shortages, climbing back toward that 323 record, would do it. Or generics losing their tariff exemption and manufacturers starting to walk away from the US market. Come back to where we started, that single plant in Gujarat, India, and the cancer patients who couldn't get their chemotherapy. That crisis was no freak accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system built over decades to deliver medicine at the lowest possible cost, with the thinnest possible margins, concentrated in the fewest possible places, where the same logic that made drugs cheap also made them fragile. Trace the wreckage, and the pattern holds. The last penicillin plant, closed in 2004. Contaminated heparin killed at least 81 people in 2008. A tornado wiped out 8% of the nation's sterile injectables in 2023, and a hurricane knocked out 60% of its IV fluids in 2024. Each event was different, yet the underlying weakness stayed exactly the same. Right now, the United States, Europe, and India are all straining to pull manufacturing back from the edge, with tariffs, stockpiles, new laws, and hundreds of billions in promised investment. Whether those measures rebuild resilience or simply raise prices and chase more manufacturers away is a question nobody has answered yet. One thing stands clear. The supply chain delivering the world's medicine is far more fragile than its scale suggests, working right up until the moment one factory, one storm, or one inspection proves that it doesn't. And that is exactly why so many of the people who understand it best are sounding the alarm.